Welcome to the lecture for Chapter 12, and in this lecture, we'll be examining the rise of reform movements in American society during the antebellum period or the early to mid 1800s. And we're going to see that really this is largely born out of the Second Great Awakening, where Americans began to grapple with their own morality and the morality of their country and started to look for ways to fix the wrongs, to right the wrongs, or to eradicate the evils that existed in American society. And so we see that take shape in various forms. There's a rise of a reform movement that is based on temperance, or the idea of limiting or really eradicating alcohol consumption. And then there's also the rise of the pacifist movement during this time. But really the two main movements, reform movements that come out of this period, are the anti-slavery movement or the abolitionist movement, and then the feminist movement, the women's suffrage movement. And the women's suffrage movement, in a large way, really is born out of the abolitionist movement because many of the abolitionist voices were female voices, women, inserting them into the public sphere, into this dialogue. Remember, they had often been considered the moral arbiters of the household and of the family, and therefore of society, and therefore they had a position in this discussion over correcting moral wrongs in the nation. And slavery was an obvious moral wrong. And so the abolitionist movement became a platform for them to also transition that into discussions about, injustices when it came to gender equality. And so we see the feminist movement of the 1800s born in a lot of ways out of the Second Great Awakening, but also out of the abolitionist movement. So we'll explore all of these reform movements that were rising up in the early to mid 1800s. This lecture will be split into 4 segments: the reform impulse, the crusade against slavery, black and white abolitionism, and the origins of feminism. We'll start with the reform impulse. And the focus question is, what were the major movements and goals of antebellum reform? Abolitionism was only one of the era's reform movements. Alexis de Tocqueville noted that in the absence of a strong national government, voluntary associations provided political and social organization through churches, fraternal orders, political clubs, etc. The reform impulse was rooted in the proliferation of these voluntary groups as Americans organized against liquor and public entertainment and mail delivery on Sunday, as well as in favor of prison, education, and labor reform, all while seeking to emphasize cooperation over competitive individualism. Nearly all of these groups tried to sway public opinion for their causes, sending out speakers, petitions, and publishing pamphlets, with many active in more than one movement. Some, such as liquor reform, were national movements, while others, such as women's rights, unionism, and education reform, were weak or non-existent in the South due to their association with anti-slavery. Many of the reform causes were international, with advocates regularly crisscrossing the Atlantic to promote their ideas. Reformers adopted a wide variety of tactics to achieve social change, including moral suasion and advocacy of governmentally forced reform, while others withdrew from society to establish their own cooperative settlements, hoping to demonstrate the superiority of the collective way of life. While reformers never constituted a majority, they profoundly impacted politics and society. About 100 reform communities were established before the Civil War. These utopian communities varied in structure and motivation. Some were governed by a charismatic leader, others were democratic. Most were religiously motivated, but some had secular origins in desires to reverse social and economic changes unleashed by the market revolution. Nearly all of these communities sought to make society cooperative, restoring social harmony in an increasingly individualistic society, and closing the widening gap between rich and poor. Their efforts to own productive property communally rather than as private individuals introduced socialism and communism into America's political language. Most utopian communities also attempted in some way to transform traditional gender roles and marriage patterns, insisting that the abolition of private property must be matched by the abolition of man's property and women. The Shakers were the most successful of the religious utopians, and at their height in the 1840s, they had settlements from Maine to Kentucky totaling 5,000 members. Founded in the late 18th century by Mother Ann Lee, a British immigrant claiming to be directed by God, the Shakers believed that men and women were spiritual equals and that their work was equally important. They eschewed traditional families. Men and women abstained from sex and lived separately in communal dorms. They were called Shakers for their religious services, which included frenzied dancing. Though they rejected private property, the Shakers found economic success by marketing plant seeds, breeding cattle, and making furniture. Oneida, founded in 1848 in upstate New York by John Humphrey Noyes, was also influential. Noyes, having become an evangelical, preached that he and his followers had achieved moral perfection and were free of sin. Noyes first founded a community in Putney, Vermont, where private property was abolished and complex marriage practiced. In Noyes' system of complex marriage, any man could propose sexual relations with any woman who was free to accept or reject the invitation. Tried for adultery, Noyes left Vermont and founded Oneida, a dictatorial community ruled by Noyes in which an early form of eugenics was practiced, which lasted until 1881. Religious utopian communities with their spiritual devotion, strong leaders, and undemocratic governance tended to last longer than secular utopian communities, which often failed due to internal strife. One notable secular community was Brook Farm, founded by New England transcendentalists in 1841 near Boston. They hoped to show that manual and intellectual labor could coexist, and modeled their community on the ideas of Charles Fourier, a French social reformer who planned communities with communal living and working, but private property for individuals. His settlements, called phalanxes, were planned to the last detail. Brook Farm became a salon of sorts, attracting ministers, writers, and teachers, until residents' dislike for farm labor caused it to disband after a few years. The most important secular communitarian was Robert Owen, a British industrialist who was appalled by early industrial conditions and built a model textile factory town at New Lanark in Scotland. In 1824, he purchased Harmony, a utopian religious community in Ohio, founded earlier in the 19th century by a German Protestant, George Rapp. Here, Owen established New Harmony. Owen envisioned a society in which all children would receive education, women would have equal rights, including access to education and divorce rights, and property would be held in common. But divisions at New Harmony led to its dissolution after a few years. Owenism influenced the early labor movement, educational reforms, and women's rights advocates. Other secular communities included Utopia, Ohio, and modern times New York, founded by Josiah Warren, an anarchist who believed that all institutions that exercise power over individuals are illegitimate. Most Americans saw property as the basis of economic independence and freedom, and marriage as the basis of social order, so they were unlikely to join these utopian communities. More typical of the reform impulse were movements directed to freeing men and women from external restraints such as slavery or from personal behavior such as drinking or criminality. Many of these movements were inspired by the religious revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, which encouraged people to believe that sinners were free moral agents who could reform and perfect both themselves and the world. Revivals popularized perfectionism, and regions like upstate New York and northern Ohio became known as the burned-over district because of the intense revivalism practiced there in the 1820s and 1830s. These locales became fertile soil for reform movements, and under revivalist influence, older efforts became more radical. Temperance shifted toward the complete elimination of drinking. Criticism of war became outright pacifism, and calls for gradual emancipation transformed into demands for immediate abolition. One such movement was temperance, which had its origins in the North's emerging middle-class culture and its search for respectability through individual self-control. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, tried to convince Americans to stop drinking altogether. In the 1830s, the society claimed to have helped hundreds of thousands to stop drinking liquor. But temperance invited great hostility from many Americans who resented others' efforts to change their behavior, which they thought no less moral than that of the temperate. Many Americans saw reform as an assault on their own freedoms. Drinking was prominent at everyday celebrations and events. Taverns were popular meeting places for working men and sites of political discussion, organizational meetings, and popular recreation. American Catholics, Irish and German immigrants in particular, often opposed reform efforts. Unlike Protestant reformers, they viewed sin as inevitable in society and individuals, and they viewed the belief that the world could be perfected as irreligious and productive of reformers' attempts to impose their own worldview on others. Catholics tended to place less emphasis on the individual as a free moral agent and emphasize communities centered on family and church. Reformers faced a contradiction between their hopes to establish a moral order and to expand personal freedom. Their notion of freedom was both liberating and controlling. They said their goal was to help Americans enjoy genuine liberty by liberating them from the slavery of drink, poverty, and sin. Yet they believed that self-fulfillment derived from self-discipline and that the free individual fully practiced self-control. Reformers worried that Western settlers and immigrants lacked self-control and required either private reform groups or the government to change their behaviors. These associations were especially successful at harnessing new printing technology to influence the era's reform movements. Reform efforts created a multitude of new institutions designed to transform individuals into free, morally upright citizens, performing services once rendered in the family or small community. In the 1830s and 1840s, Americans built jails for criminals, asylums for the mentally ill, and orphanages. These institutions emerged from reformers' belief that social ills could be cured and eliminated by placing individuals in an environment where their character could be changed. While today many of these institutions have become overcrowded and focus mostly on holding inmates at bay away from society, reformers originally hoped to make the afflicted into productive, self-disciplined citizens. The most significant institution-building effort before the Civil War was the move to establish common schools, tax-supported state school systems open to all children. In the early 19th century, most children, if educated at all, were educated in local schools, private academies, or at home. Many children had no access to education. Horace Mann, a Massachusetts lawyer and Whig politician, led efforts to create new common schools. Mann embraced industrialization, but hoped that universal public education would restore social equality by bringing children from all social classes together and giving them an equal opportunity for upward social mobility. Mann also insisted that schools would stabilize society by disciplining children and building individual character, teaching obedience to authority and adherence to strict time periods. With support from labor unions, factory owners, and middle-class reformers, by 1860 every northern state had tax-supported school systems for children. In the South, planters viewed literacy among blacks as dangerous and opposed taxation to support the education of poor white children, resulting in slowly developed schools and persistently lagging behind the North in education.